Welcome everybody to my meta review for standard best of 1 and best of 3 for week 10 of Lost Caverns of Ixalan. So this week we've got some really exciting ones. We've got 2 new builds in best of 3 and some updates to the best of 1 lists, as well as a budget list. So if you are new to Magic the Gathering and you are low on wildcards, fast forward to the end of the video or watch it all the way through. But yeah, we've got a really nice budget list that I'm excited to check out in best of 1. So to start things off here, we're going to start off with the Bant Cauldron deck by Trail of Magic, which is a mythic best of 3 list. And we've seen this combo before. So it's an infinite combo that's based off of Kami of Whispered Hopes, giving you the +1/+1 counter and the ability to tap for mana equal to your power. And then you combine this with the Sleep Cursed Fairy to untap and give you infinite mana every single time that you tap if you combine it with the Agatha's Soul Cauldron. So we've got some kind of like mill synergies to try to kind of enable this. And like Rona is a really great way to filter through your deck, and being able to have infinite mana to untap it means that you can draw through your entire deck to find your combos. And so this used to be running the Hellkite, the red dragon that could ping for 2 to deal 1 damage to any target. And instead of going for the infinite combo of infinite mana, infinite damage, this one's going for Falco Spara Pactweaver and playing some white. So this is a 3/3 flying trample that enters the battlefield with a shield counter on it, and then you may look at the top card of your library anytime, and you can cast spells from the top of your library by removing a counter from a creature you control, in addition to paying their other costs. So kind of interesting, because it's not really like a win condition as much as like infinite damage, right? As it is just digging to stuff that is good threats. So the real reason here to lean into white, though, is that it gives you better interaction through Get Lost and the Wandering Emperor, and as well as Virtue of Loyalty. So Virtue of Loyalty gives you the +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, and then untapping those creatures, which helps enable your combo. So I thought this was kind of an interesting way to go. Like, okay, we're going to go towards making maybe a little bit more consistent on hitting the combo and setting things up, but a little bit less consistent of once you hit the combo that you just win the game. So we're trying to win the game on the following turn. So really curious to see how this goes. It performed quite well when it surprised everybody with what the combo was doing, and but it hit Mythic, so I believe in the deck. And it's a best of 3, so we've got some interesting sideboards here. We've got 4 copies of Hopeful Initiate, which can train into getting those +1/+1 counters, and you can bring it in if you need some specific hate against artifact or enchantments. Get Lost, another copy for more artifact and enchantment hate. Enchantment hate. Wren and Realmbreaker, which is an enabler because it allows you to mill 3 cards, and then you may put a permanent card from among those mill cards into your hand. So this is good for getting the combo started. And then also just being able to fix a little bit, when you're playing Bant, being able your lands tapping for any color is relevant. And then you can ultimate this to play lands and permanents from your graveyard, which could be good for recycling. 4 copies of Make Disappear. So this one, you're going to want to bring in Make Disappear if you're up against like a deck running Sunfall. Because like Cavern of Souls prevents you from countering a creature spell, but Make Disappear still works really fine if they're just doing interaction. And then we've got 4 copies of Wedding Announcement. If we need to like outvalue another mid-range deck, this one's pretty good as long as you're not just getting completely run over, and gives you token and card draw. Second on my list is Rakdos Vampires by Will Ecker, or Erker. And this is another one that hit, best of 3 lists that hit Mythic. And this one, we've had vampires have been a thing for a while, right? But they haven't been a top tier deck. And so this is kind of exciting to see it come back. And a lot of it has to do with Preacher of the Schism being a vampire from Lost Caverns of Ixalan. But we've got some classics here, right? Voldaren Epicure gives you a blood token and pings for 1. We've got the Voldaren Bloodcaster, which is a 2/1 flyer. Whenever it or another non-token creature you control dies, create a blood token, and then whenever you create a blood token, if you control 5 or more, it can transform into the 3/3 flyer, and then at the beginning of your combat on your turn, up to 1 blood token becomes a 2/2 bat, creature with flying and haste, in addition to its other types. And so what's nice about this, though, too, is that those 2/2 tokens remain tokens even if the 3/3 gets removed. So this can create give you those blood synergies. Another blood synergy is Blood Tithe Harvester. So this is really great removal, and in this deck you're going to have plenty of blood. This is a staple in basically every Rakdos midrange deck we've seen for the past year. And then we've also got the Markov Baron, which this one you don't see a lot outside of Vampire decks. This one's kind of just for this one. But we get a 2/2 Convoke Lifelinker Vampire that other vampires you control get +1/+1. So we can play out cheap vampires, use them to convoke, and play another cheap vampire that pumps everything. And we also have Madness. So Madness allows you to play this card if you discard it. You can cast it for its Madness cost. And so this works nicely for discarding it and playing it for free off of blood token synergies. And then we've got some just classic aggressive cards like the Bloodthirsty Adversary. Seen this in mono red. You can play this one as a 2/2 haste, or you can play it for 5 and you get to bring back something mana value 3 or less, an instant or sorcery from your graveyard. So this works amazingly well with the Go for the Throat, which is one of the best removals that mono black or black has to offer. And on top of that, we've got NT, Cynical of the Sun, which works with the Madness of being able to, when you attack, discard a card, play the Lord, gives you additional dig, gives you +1/+1 counters to help push damage. And then, lastly, we've got Preacher of the Schism, which is a 2/4 Death Touch that either makes a 1/1 vampire creature token with lifelink, which gets additional synergies and buffed by the Lord, or draws you a card and loses 1 life, or does both, all depending on what your opponent's mana total is. And then for the sideboard, we've got Razorlash Transmigrant, which I like bringing this one in against Domain. Anytime that you're, or Esper Midrange, anytime your opponent is not running strictly mono colors and that has a lot of non-basic lands, then this is a nice recurring threat, as long as it doesn't get exiled. Vampire's Vengeance deals 2 damage to each non-vampire creature and creates a blood token, so this is kind of a nice alternative if you are up against some of the board flood strategies of Azorius Soldiers and Azorius tokens, Boros tokens. 4 copies of Ob Nixilis the Adversary, so not exactly sure which matchup the creator is planning to bring this one in. But Planeswalkers tend to be a really good answer if your opponent has board wipes, because the board wipes don't affect Planeswalkers. So this kind of gives you an alternative win condition, and is just a really nice, when you're in Rakdos, Ob Nixilis is a good threat to have. Dreams of Steel and Oil allows you to choose an artifact or creature from it and exile those cards, kind of an alternative to Duress. So bringing these in if against whatever matchup in game 2, bringing in the Duress if you're up against a spell heavy list, bringing in Dreams of Steel and Oil if you're up against a heavy artifact or creature list. And then we've got Lithomantic Barrage, which is a classic. It deals 5 damage for 1 red if you're up against white or blue, some targeted hate there. And then 1 more copy of Vampire's Vengeance. And every week I like to go over the tournament winners from the Standard Challenge. I think it's a really good way to kind of keep an eye on what's happening in Best of 3. And this week, Mono Red Aggro by O. Daniel Akos won first place on the Standard Challenge 32 on January 13th. And then third place by Bill's Scythe on the Standard Challenge 64 on the 14th. So Mono Red, it looks like it was in a decent spot. If we look at the list that we're going to cover later with Mogged, it looked like they were anticipating some more Mono Red in the meta as well. And so if we compare this one to last week, there have been some decent changes to the list. So running 1 additional Monastery Swiftspear, so kicking it up to 3 copies. We're down 2 copies of the Phoenix Chick, which is something that we're also going to see in the Best of 1 meta, is decreasing the amount of Phoenix Chicks. And I like this because it doesn't often recur very well, right? And you're often just attacking with a 1/1 flyer in the air. It does have some synergies with being able to put the Wicked Roll on it with the Charming Scoundrel, but a lot of times you want to be creating like a treasure token and going in a different direction. So dropping the Phoenix Chicks, I'm curious to see how that one plays out. And we've got one copy of the Shivan Devastator, which we've seen in some best of one lists, allows you to kind of curve and allows you to have an answer to if the deck does flood out, being able to play something. And it does synergize with Godric, because Godric gives all of your, it has the ability to give fire breathing, but not only to itself, to all of your dragons get +1/+0. So if you have Godric and Shivan Devastator, then you can give each +1/+0 for 1 red if you've triggered Celebration, which is pretty nice. And then we've got 2 less of the Felden Ronim Excavator, so down to 1 of these. And Felden, because it can't block, is very play versus draw dependent. So in best of 3, that's more of an issue than in best of 1, where you're just trying to coin flip for the play. And so I like decreasing the amount of Feldens here. And then we've got Godric Cloaked Reveler up to 3 copies from 2, and 1 copy of Thundering Raiju, which I think is kind of fun because it does synergize with the Wicked rolls off of Charming Scoundrel and Monstrous Rage, and it gives you kind of a little bit of late game reach and an additional threat. So I was talking to a person in my community about whether or not Thundering Raiju would be a good inclusion in best of 1. And I think it could be. Typically, this deck caps out on 3 in best of 1. But in best of 3, there's a little bit of a slower meta. And so Thundering Raiju works nicely here as a 1-of. I'd like to see how this plays. And then we've got one Monstrous Rage added to the list, gives you an additional modified trigger for the Thundering Raiju. And then we're down 1 copy of Witchstalker Frenzy to a total of 3. And tweaking the lands a little bit, so we've got 1 less Sokenzan for 1 more mountain. Or no, sorry, 1 more Sokenzan for 1 less mountain. Anyway, tweaked the lands a little bit. And then the best of 3 sideboard used to be ultra clean, and we've tweaked it a little bit, so we're down 2 copies of the Furnace Punisher, which is the one that punishes people for not having basic lands. And we're down 1 copy of the In the Festivities, which is a nice way to answer the kind of board-wide board flood strategies. And we're down 1 Urabrask's Forge, which was good to bring in some inevitability against like control decks or decks that you were having a difficulty closing against. And for these substitutions, we're running 1-ofs that are, we got Jaya Fiery Negotiator, similar to the Urabrask's Forge, just kind of gives you an answer to the board wipe strategies and a little bit more of a late game reach. And then we've also got Koth. Yeah, Koth, Fire of Resistance. Same thing as Jaya. Is just kind of giving you something that's a little bit less prone to getting just completely blown out by board wipes, and gives you a little bit better against a mid-range deck that might be outfouling you slightly. And then 1 more copy of Witchstalker Frenzy in the sideboard. You can bring this in if you're looking, if it has good targets to hit, right? Witchstalker Frenzy looks pretty bad if you end up against like a control list, for example. But it looks pretty good if you're playing up against Shieldred or another mid-range deck. All right, second place on the Standard Challenge 32 on January 13th was taken down by a Rakdos mid-range deck by Hamuda, and not much has changed. So compared to last week, they took down 1 copy of Gix, Yawgmoth Praetor, and they added in 1 copy of Tenacious Underdog. And in the best of 3 sideboard, they took out 1 Gix's Command for 1 Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal, which is the mythic black bat god. So not enough to really like bring it up, otherwise it'd be like super short, right? So we're going to move on here to Esper Midrange by Yomon, which took down 3rd place in the Standard Challenge 32 on January 13th. And if we compare this to last week, we see some significant changes, or at least a different approach. Sorry, I had the wrong Esper Midrange list brought up at the beginning there. So this is the one by Yomon. And so this one is deciding to run 4 copies of Spyglass Siren, 1 less copy of the Fairy Mastermind, 1 copy of Malcolm, ditching the Lorn of the Third Path, a Preacher of the Schism, and down 1 Preacher of the Schism to a total of 2, and up 1 copy of Tishana's Tidebinder, down the 2 copies of Shieldred, the Apocalypse in the Main, and up 1 copy of Cut Down, down 1 copy of Destroy Evil, down 1 copy of Make Disappear, and then tweaking the lands to reflect those changes. So we've got 2 more Caves of Kolios, which is the Pain land. We've got down 3 copies of a Darker Waste, so just cutting that entirely, cutting the Agonjo, cutting Rafine's Tower down to 1 copy, adding in 2 copies of Seachrome Coast, and bringing in upping 1 Shattered Sanctum to a total of 4, down 2 copies of the Shipwreck Marsh, and +1 Swamp, +1 Underground River. And so basically, the tweaks to this are leaning more heavily into the drawing cards off of Gix from the early flyers. And so I thought that was kind of cool. And because we've only got Rafine and 1 copy of Destroy Evil, it kind of makes sense to dip out of the Agonjo in the main. And in the best of 3 sideboard, we've got 2 cutdowns, Duress, Destroy Evil, Disdainful Stroke, Liliana of the Veil. And we've seen that this one is particularly nice if you're up against control to attack their hand. Negate for answering your opponent's, board wipes. Anoint with Affliction, which is particularly nice against Golgari because of the recurring threat of the Dread Knight. Path of Peril for some board hate if you're up against a board flood strategy. Enrika Domnathi, which I thought this one was kind of interesting. So I forgot to cover the best of 3 sideboard last week, which I apologize. The Esper Midrange was bringing in some interesting kind of alternative threats. So we saw like Obscura Interceptor last week. And so Henrika, each player sacrifices a creature can be really good against specific matchups that are very creature-centric. And then you draw a card and lose a life. It's kind of something that this deck is interested in doing as well. And then you're getting a 3/4 flying Death Touch lifelinker and being able to give each creature you control with flying Death Touch and or lifelink gets +1/+0 can just give you an alternative, another flyer, right? Because the way this deck wins is by pumping through Connive through Rafine and having evasive threats. So I thought Henrico was kind of an interesting one to bring in if each player sacrifices a creature is looking like a good way to go. There's also Akhlazot's Deepest Betrayal, which is another one that you can bring in if your opponent is light on exile and you have this recurring threat. Both have lifelink too, so if you're getting run over, this can kind of help you stabilize. And then we've got 1 copy of Gix's Command, which has a lot of versatility, and this one either as a board wipe, giving something +2/+2 and lifelink, being able to bring back stuff that you've discarded off of your Connive is just I like the Gix's Command is one of my favorite cards. So and then we've got another Esper midrange deck, and we this was the other Esper midrange deck that took down first place in the Standard Challenge 64 on January 14th, and this one was the one by Mogged. And so if we compare this one to last week's Esper midrange deck, and the one that I just showcased, you can see that they kind of took it in a different direction, which is fun to see Esper midrange having so much flexibility in the way that you can build it. So this one decided to cut all 4 copies of the Fairy Mastermind, 3 copies of Denic Pious Apprentice, and I really think this reflects anticipating seeing more mono red in the meta. And down 2 copies of the Gix, Yawgmoth Praetor, so not leaning heavily into chipping an early card advantage through the flyers, and increasing the Lord Skitter, Sewer King, instead of the Preacher of the Schism. We've got 2 copies of Lord Skitter, which works nicely with the Virtue of Loyalty and overrunning your opponent's board. And we've also got 1 more copy of Tishana's Tidebinder. So both lists deciding to bring up Tishana's Tidebinder up to 2, which I think is this card is it reads worse than it actually plays. You can hit a lot of interesting targets with Tishana's Tidebinder, and I think specifically against mono red, being able to make Kumano faces Kakazan into a enchantment that does nothing and doesn't become a 2/2 is pretty awesome. So we've also got the down 2 copies of the Urtai Resurrected, and down the 2 copies of the Shieldred Apocalypse, and leaning more heavily into the white synergies, Also, we're tweaking cut down up 1, which I think reflects anticipating more mono red. So up to 3 total copies there. Down 1, make disappear. And down 2 copies of the Destroy Evil, at least in the main. Down 3 copies of the Subterranean Schooner. And because we want our board to get developed by virtue of loyalty, the Schooner's a little bit of a non-bo if we're going to run the virtue of loyalty. And yeah, so Wedding Announcement, 4 copies of Wedding Announcement, 3 copies of the Virtue of Loyalty, as well as the Wandering Emperor, just leaning more heavily into the white synergies. And then the lands have also been tweaked to kind of reflect that. So we're down the 2 copies of A Darker Waste, up 2 copies of Caves of Kolios, up a Deserted Beach, down an island, up a Plains, down a Rafine's Tower, up 2 Restless Anchorages. So we're running 4 Restless Anchorages, and Mog decided to run additional lands to lean more heavily into the man lands than what we were seeing last week. So I thought that was a cool change. We've also got 1 more copy of Shattered Sanctum and Takanuma, so leaning more heavily into the black legendary land to bring back important targets like Rafine. Excuse me. And then we've got down 2 copies of the Shipwreck March. And for the best of 3 sideboard, we've got up 1 Duress, down 1 Cut Down, up an Anoint with Affliction, which again is really good against the Golgari midrange. And I think here is really where you can see like the anticipation of playing against more mono red by including Knockout Blow in the sideboard. We've up 1 more copy of Destroy Evil and bringing in the Parasitic Grasp. This is another one. So 2 copies of Parasitic Grasp, anticipating potentially more more human synergies. It's also really good just if we're targeting like sniping a Dinnik. And then we've also got so they're ditching the Gix's Command and the Aclazots and the Obscura Interceptor and Tidebinder to kind of bring in this more targeted point removal against specific strategies. All right, and then last but not least, I need to mention that Rakdos Midrange by That One Kid won 2nd place on the Standard Challenge 64 on January 14th. But if we compare this to last week, very few changes have happened. Basically, a sideboard, right? So they took out Liliana of the Veil in the main, and they brought in a cut down from the sideboard. So they just replaced those. So in the sideboard, 1 less cut down, 1 more Liliana. So that covers it for best of 3. Now we're going to look at best of 1. And best of 1's meta is a little bit more stale than best of 3. And is primarily being dominated by mono-white humans and mono-red aggro. Which it's been that way for a while. And so, you know, it's always a little bit of a struggle how to make that interesting, covering best of 1 each week. But there are some interesting changes. So number 1, I think the top performing deck is Mono White Humans, and I did just showcase 50 matches of Mono White Humans, and I mentioned how I did not like the ossification. So this one is reflecting those changes, and so I like to see that when the stats on Untapped reflect what I was thinking should be cut from the deck. So ding. So this one's running 1 more copy of Warden of the Inner Sky, up from 3. And up 2 copies of Intrepid Adversary, instead of running Ossification, so cutting the 2 copies of Ossification, and 1 less Brutal Cathar. And I like this, because the Brutal Cathar has felt kind of awkward. Exiling the opponent's threats, especially with the board-wide strategies like Boros tokens, the single-point removal just felt kind of like you were doing something slower than what your opponent was doing. So leaning a little bit less off of dealing with our opponent and more just with like, can they answer what we're doing? I like the direction that they're taking this. So if you're going to run mono white humans, I'd be checking out this list this week and see if you like it more than the one that I showcased for the match summary. And then number 2 is mono red aggro, and this one's going to make it onto the poll this week because I still have yet to play mono red aggro in the best of 1 meta for Lost Caverns of Ixalan. So eventually you guys are going to have to let me play mono red aggro. But so if we compare this one to last week, we see similar changes to what we saw in the best of 3 lists, which was decreasing Phoenix Chick down to 2 copies instead of 4. And like I said before, I think this one is just, there's not a lot of times where you're actually bringing back the Phoenix Chick as a +2/+2 flyer. And so a lot of times this just feels kind of not as good as what other things that you could be doing, right? And so we've okay, Bloodthirsty Adversary is up to 3 copies from 2 from last week, and I like this change if we're going to be including the Nahiri's Warcrafting, which this list is deciding to run 2 copies of Nahiri's Warcrafting, and we're cutting the Shivan Devastator that pairs with the Godric, and instead upping 1 more copy of Squee and cutting 1 copy of the Monstrous Rage. So, very curious to see how this goes. I'm a fan of Nahiri's Warcrafting. I think it works nicely with the Bloodthirsty Adversary, and really curious to see how this list performs in Lost Caverns of Ixalan. I'm sure it's very play versus draw dependent, but always curious to check it out. And last but not least, we have the budget deck. And so I would have included this at the beginning of the video, which is when I usually cover the budget lists. It's just that I didn't find it until I was looking for an 8th deck to cover this week. And I bumped into this mono blue tempo deck, and it looks really good, especially for only having 1 rare. So the 1 rare in the deck is March of the Swirling Mist. I haven't played the deck yet, but I do believe that you could remove this for an additional Fading Hope and go for a 0 rares build. It's going to work better if you have it, though, right? And then I guess we have 2 rares. We have Otawara, Soaring City, and then the rest of it is just commons and uncommons. So we've got Network Disruptor, which is really nice for bringing in the ninjutsu of the Moon Circuit Hacker, so that we get 2 damage unblocked and draw a card, and then we can replay it to continue to tap our opponent's threats. We've got the Spyglass Siren, which we can put a map token on to make it into a 2/2 flyer. Shore Up is to protect your stuff from removal, and Fading Hope is as well, so we can either bounce our opponent's stuff and trigger a scry, or we can return our own thing to protect it from our opponent's removal. Kind of depends on what's going on. But the real juice of this whole thing is Gingerbrute. So the Gingerbrute is a 1/1 haste artifact that can't be blocked this turn except for by creatures with haste if you pay 1. And what's nice about that is if you pair it with Zoetic Glyph, which is one of the top performing cards in Lost Caverns of Ixalan, you get a 5/4 artifact that can't be blocked except for by creatures with haste. So you kind of get a 5/4 unblockable, and then you can protect it with Shore Up. And that's kind of the win condition of this deck. So then we've got Machine Over Matter, which, similar to the Fading Hope, can be used to return stuff to your hand, whether or not it's your opponent's stuff to bounce it or your own. We've got the High Speed Hover Bike, which enters the battlefield tapping an additional creature and gives you a 2/2 flash vehicle with crew 1. So this, along with the Network Disruptor, is just to remove your opponent's blockers and push in damage. We've got the Prosperous Thief, which is another payoff of having these evasive flyers that have ninjutsu. When this one deals combat damage to a player, you create a treasure token and hit for 3. So we can also... so like getting in with these Network Disruptors allows us to hit for 3 damage or for 2 damage and draw a card. Then we've also got Unctus's Retrofitter, which when it enters the battlefield, up to 1 target artifact you control becomes an artifact creature with base power and toughness 4/4 for as long as the Retrofitter remains on the battlefield. So we could turn our Gingerbrute into a 4/4 creature and then hit through that way instead of Zoetic Glyph. Or we can just like make a treasure off of Prosperous Thief into a 4/4. So I think there's some really cool things that this deck is doing. Looking at the stats on Untapped, I do think that it would perform well enough in the meta that it's a viable deck. I don't think it's going to be like a tier 1 deck like Mono White or Mono Red, but I do think it's going to be like a tier 2 deck, and a tier 2 deck with no necessary rares in the build is quite appealing. And then we've also got 2 Roadside Reliquaries, which allows us to draw a card if you control an artifact and draw a card if you control an enchantment. So this kind of gives us just an additional late game dig, and kind of curious to see. I'm not 100% sold on this, but it's best if you can draw for 2, which technically if you have the Zoetic Glyph and an artifact, then it draws 2. So, but I think the Zoetic Glyph is the only thing in the deck that's an enchantment. Oh no, this is an enchantment creature. Okay, so between the Moon Circuit Hacker and the Zoetic Glyph, that makes sense. Yeah, interesting. Okay, so a little bit of late game dig off of your lands gives you a little bit, and then you've got the Otawara for bounce. So, thank you for listening to my ramblings on the best of 1 and best of 3 meta review. If you like this sort of thing, I do one every single week, as well as run 50 matches of one of these lists for best of 1 to kind of give you an idea of how it's doing to save you time and money and wildcards and all of that. So remember to hit like and subscribe and place your vote for next week's archetype. And we're getting close here to the end of Lost Caverns of Ixalan, and we'll switch gears into Murders at Karlov Manor at the beginning of February. So take care, everybody, and maybe I'll see you on the ladder.